I'm Elizabeth Harlow, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how my own mother tried to steal my inheritance, not through lawyers or legal tricks, but through something far more insidious: emotional manipulation, forged documents, and a decades-long campaign to convince me I was mentally unstable. 3 weeks ago, I finally discovered the truth, and what I did next left my entire family in absolute shock. My father, Thomas Harlow, passed away 8 months ago after a sudden heart attack. He was 67, a self-made real estate developer who'd built a substantial portfolio of commercial properties across the Midwest. Dad and I had always been close. I was his only child, and he'd raised me largely on his own after divorcing my mother Catherine when I was 7 years old. The divorce had been bitter, filled with accusations and resentment that never quite healed. But Dad got primary custody, and I saw my mother on alternating weekends and holidays. Growing up, my mother always seemed just slightly off, not in obvious ways that others would notice, but in subtle manipulations that left me constantly questioning my own perceptions. She'd tell me Dad said things he never said, insist events happened differently than I remembered them, and whenever I contradicted her version of reality, she'd sigh deeply and say with profound sadness, "Oh, Elizabeth, you've always had such an active imagination, just like your Aunt Margaret, who had to be hospitalized." That phrase, "just like your Aunt Margaret," became a weapon she wielded throughout my childhood. Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, had apparently suffered from severe mental illness and spent years in psychiatric facilities before dying in her 40s. My mother brought her up constantly, always with the implication that I might be heading down the same troubling path if I didn't accept her version of reality as absolute truth. When I was in high school, I started keeping detailed journals, documenting conversations and events, because I'd begun to genuinely doubt my own memory. My mother's accounts of family gatherings, arguments, and even simple daily interactions never quite matched what I'd experienced. But she'd present her version with such conviction that I wondered if something was genuinely wrong with my mind. The gaslighting intensified after I graduated college and started working as a financial analyst in Chicago. I'd moved there specifically to create distance from my mother, who by then was living in Minneapolis and constantly calling to share her concerns about my mental state. "Your father mentioned you've been having episodes at work," she'd say. When I'd call Dad to ask what she meant, he'd be completely confused. He'd never said anything of the sort, had never even spoken to her in months. Dad was the steady constant in my life. He'd built Harlow Properties from nothing. Starting with a single duplex, he renovated himself in his 20s and gradually expanding into commercial real estate. By the time I was in college, he owned shopping centers, office buildings, and several residential complexes worth tens of millions collectively. He was meticulous about his business, keeping detailed records of every transaction, every property, every investment decision. When I turned 25, Dad had me join the business formally, teaching me the intricacies of property management, tenant relations, and investment strategies. We'd spend hours discussing his various properties, and he made it clear that everything would eventually be mine. "You've got a good head for this business, Lizzie," he'd tell me, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "You understand that real estate isn't just about properties, it's about people, relationships, building something that lasts beyond yourself." My mother had never been involved in the business. She'd received a substantial settlement in the divorce, enough to live comfortably without working, and had made a series of questionable investment decisions over the years that gradually depleted her assets. By the time I was in my 30s, she was living in a modest apartment, driving an aging car, and constantly hinting that she was struggling financially, though she never directly asked Dad or me for money. The day Dad died, I was at work when I received the call from his neighbor. He'd collapsed while mowing his lawn on a Saturday morning. Massive heart attack. Gone before the ambulance arrived. The grief was overwhelming, but there was no time to process it properly because within hours, my mother descended like a coordinating general, taking control of every arrangement despite having been divorced from my father for 27 years. She showed up at the hospital where they'd taken his body, presenting herself as the grieving widow, though they hadn't been married for nearly 3 decades. She called the funeral home Dad had once mentioned preferring, made arrangements without consulting me, chose the casket, selected the flowers, wrote the obituary. When I tried to participate in these decisions, she'd pat my hand sympathetically and say, "You're too emotional right now, sweetheart. Let me handle the difficult details. You know how overwhelmed you get." The funeral was a blur of grief and my mother's performance. She wore black, dabbed her eyes with tissues, accepted condolences as if she were the primary mourner, while I stood beside her feeling increasingly like a supporting character in someone else's drama. Dad's business associates, friends, and distant relatives all expressed their sympathies, and several mentioned how wonderful it was that my parents had apparently reconciled before his death, a complete fabrication my mother had been spreading to anyone who would listen. After the funeral, as people gathered at Dad's house for the reception, my mother pulled me aside into his study, the room where he'd conducted business, where we'd had countless conversations about properties and investments and life. She closed the door carefully and turned to me with an expression of deep concern, mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. "Elizabeth, we need to discuss something important," she began, her voice dropping to that particular tone she used when delivering bad news. "Your father's estate." I nodded, assuming she wanted to know about the will, about arrangements, about the legal process that would transfer his properties to me. Dad and I had discussed this many times. He had a will, properly executed, leaving everything to me except for some charitable donations to causes he cared about. It was straightforward, documented, exactly what we'd planned together. But that's not what my mother wanted to discuss. She reached into her expensive leather purse and pulled out several official-looking documents, spreading them across Dad's desk with careful precision. "I found these in your father's safe deposit box," she said. "He'd given me a key years ago, just in case anything happened to him." That was the first red flag. Dad would never have given her access to his safe deposit box. They barely spoke, and when they did, conversations were brief and functional, usually about logistics regarding me when I was younger. But I was too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed to process this inconsistency immediately, so I looked at the documents she'd placed before me. They appeared to be amendments to Dad's will, dated just 6 months before his death. According to these papers, Dad had changed his estate plan substantially. The properties were to be split, 60% to a trust controlled by my mother for Elizabeth's care and long-term stability, and 40% to me directly, but with significant restrictions. I wouldn't have access to my portion until I was 40 years old and had undergone psychiatric evaluation, proving I was mentally competent to manage substantial assets. I stared at these documents in complete disbelief. "This can't be right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad and I just reviewed his will together 4 months ago. None of this was in there. He never mentioned any concerns about my mental health or any need for a trust controlled by you." My mother's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with vindication. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed, that familiar phrase that always preceded her rewriting of reality. "Your father didn't want to upset you, but he'd been very worried about you. He called me several times in his final months, expressing concerns about your stability, your decision-making, episodes you'd been having at the office." None of this was true. Not a single word. Dad and I spoke nearly every day. I knew his concerns, his worries, his plans, and none of them involved doubting my mental competency or putting my mother in control of anything related to his estate. But she continued, pulling out more papers, medical records, or what appeared to be medical records, with letterheads from psychiatric facilities I'd never visited, documenting treatments I'd never received for conditions I'd never been diagnosed with. "Your father assembled all of this," she explained, her voice taking on that sympathetic but firm tone. "Documentation of your struggles with reality, your inability to maintain stable relationships, your paranoid episodes. He loved you deeply, Elizabeth, but he recognized that you needed protection from yourself, structure and guidance to prevent you from destroying everything he built. If you're watching this and you've ever been gaslit by someone close to you, someone who systematically tried to make you doubt your own mind and perception, please leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories, because what happened next in mine is something I never could have predicted, and I think others who've experienced this need to know they're not alone. And if this story resonates with you so far, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories and realize they're not crazy for questioning the manipulative people in their lives. I stood in my father's study, looking at these documents that couldn't possibly be real, while my mother watched me with an expression I'd seen countless times before, patience mixed with superiority, waiting for me to crack, to accept her version of events, to doubt myself once again. But something was different this time. Maybe it was grief sharpening my perception, or maybe I'd finally reached my limit after 34 years of manipulation. But instead of crumbling, I felt something cold and clear settle into my mind. "I need to see the original will," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos churning inside me. Dad kept copies of everything important in his office, safe here at the house. "The combination is my birthday," he told me that years ago. My mother's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second. Something that looked like panic before her mask of concern snapped back into place. "Oh, honey, I already checked there. These documents were the only ones present. Your father must have removed the old will when he updated everything. That was impossible. Dad was meticulous about documentation, about keeping records of every version of every important paper. He'd shown me his filing system himself, explaining that in real estate, you never destroyed old documents. You archived them because you never knew when you might need to reference previous agreements or decisions. He wouldn't have simply removed an entire will without keeping it in his record somewhere." I walked past my mother to the safe built into the wall behind a painting of Lake Superior, Dad's favorite place. I entered the combination carefully, my birth month, day, and year. The safe clicked open. Inside were folders, exactly as I remembered, meticulously labeled in Dad's precise handwriting. Property deeds, insurance policies, investment accounts, and there, in a red folder labeled Estate Documents Current, was his will. I pulled it out and opened it, my hands trembling slightly. It was dated 18 months ago, exactly as I remembered. Everything left to me, with specific instructions about maintaining the properties, continuing his charitable donations, and a personal letter he'd written to me about his hopes for the business's future. No mention of my mother. No psychiatric evaluations. No trusts controlled by anyone but me. This was the real will, the one we'd discussed, the one that made sense. I turned to face my mother, holding the folder. "This is Dad's actual will, the one in the safe where he told me it would be, exactly where he kept all his important documents. So where did those papers you're showing me actually come from?" For the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother's carefully constructed facade completely crack. Her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, a cold hardness I'd never seen before, like she decided there was no point in pretending anymore. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice dropping the sympathetic tone entirely. "Your father owed me. After everything I sacrificed in our marriage, after raising you, after the divorce settlement that barely covered my expenses while he built his empire, I deserve a portion of what he left behind." "You received your divorce settlement 27 years ago," I replied, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Dad paid every penny the court ordered. You're not entitled to anything from his estate just because you think you deserved more back then." She stepped closer, and I could see the desperation starting to show through the anger. "Those documents are legal. I had them prepared by attorneys. They'll hold up in probate court, especially with all the medical documentation I've compiled over the years about your instability." And there it was, finally out in the open. Not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, a deliberate, calculated plan to steal my inheritance by using the very weapon she'd been sharpening for decades, the narrative that I was mentally unstable, that I couldn't be trusted with my own perceptions, my own memories, my own life. She'd been building this case since I was a child, just like your Aunt Margaret comment, every time she'd contradicted my memory of events, every fabricated conversation with my father, all of it had been laying groundwork for this moment. "Get out," I said quietly. "Get out of my father's house right now." "This isn't over, Elizabeth," she replied, gathering her forged documents from the desk. "I have attorneys, documentation, witnesses who'll testify about your episodes. You can't win this fight." After she left, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows, I sat in Dad's leather chair and let myself cry for the first time since he died. Not just for losing him, but for the betrayal, for the decades of manipulation, for the realization that my own mother had been systematically trying to make me doubt my sanity, specifically so she could use it against me to steal what my father had worked his entire life to build. But grief and anger are useful emotions when properly channeled. I wiped my eyes, took several deep breaths, and started making calls. First to Dad's attorney, Gerald Morrison, who'd handled his estate planning for 20 years. Gerald's voice was heavy with sympathy when he answered. "Elizabeth, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man and a valued client. Gerald, I need to see you immediately. Tomorrow morning, if possible. My mother just showed me documents she claims are amendments to Dad's will, placing most of his estate in a trust she controls because of supposed mental health concerns about me. But I have the real will from Dad's safe, and nothing like what she described is in it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Gerald said something that made my blood run cold. "Elizabeth, your mother contacted me 3 weeks ago, claiming she had your father's updated estate documents. I told her that I was Thomas's attorney of record and had his most recent will filed with me, dated 18 months ago, leaving everything to you. She insisted I must have an outdated version. I informed her that unless your father had contacted another attorney without telling me, which would be highly unusual given our relationship, what I had was definitive. She became quite agitated and threatened legal action." "So she knew her documents were fake," I said, the realization settling in. "She knew you had the real will, and she approached me anyway, hoping I'd be too grief-stricken to verify anything. Just accept her version of reality, like I'd been conditioned to do my entire life." "It appears that way," Gerald agreed carefully. "I'll need to see these documents she showed you. If she's presenting fraudulent estate documents, that's a serious crime. We should also discuss filing your father's actual will for probate immediately and potentially seeking a restraining order if she continues to harass you with false claims." I scheduled an appointment for first thing the following morning. Then I called my father's business partner, James Chin, who'd worked alongside Dad for 15 years and knew every detail of Harlow Properties. James had been at the funeral, had expressed his condolences, had assured me he'd help with anything I needed during the transition. When I explained what my mother had done, his response was immediate and angry. "That woman is unbelievable," he said, his usually calm demeanor cracking. "Thomas specifically told me 6 months ago that he'd updated his will to make absolutely certain everything went to you cleanly, no complications, no opportunities for your mother to interfere. He said, and I quote, 'Catherine will try something when I'm gone. She's been hinting for years that she deserves part of the business. Make sure Elizabeth knows the real will is in my safe at home and with Gerald Morrison. Don't let Catherine anywhere near the company.'" Those words, Dad's actual words, spoken to his business partner just months before his death, hit me like a physical blow. He'd known. He'd anticipated exactly what my mother would try to do, and he'd taken steps to protect me and his legacy from her manipulation. But he'd also known he couldn't protect me from the psychological warfare, from the gaslighting, from the years of conditioning that made me doubt myself. "James, I need you to do something for me," I said. "I need documentation of every conversation you had with Dad about his estate plans, about his concerns regarding my mother, about his intentions for the business. Written statements, emails, anything that establishes his actual mental state and wishes in the months before his death. "You'll have everything by tomorrow afternoon," he promised. "And Elizabeth, your father was so proud of you. He used to say you had twice the business since he did at your age. Whatever your mother's trying to do, don't let her make you doubt what Thomas thought of you or your capabilities." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed in Dad's guest room. I hadn't been able to face going back to my apartment in Chicago yet, and my mind kept circling back through decades of interactions with my mother. How many times had she told me I'd misremembered something? How many conversations had she insisted happened differently than I recalled? How many times had she invoked Aunt Margaret, using mental illness as a threat, as a weapon, as a way to keep me off balance and compliant? And then I remembered something crucial. When I was 16, shortly after I'd started keeping detailed journals because of my mother's gaslighting, she'd come to stay with Dad and me for a week while her apartment was being fumigated. I'd been careful to hide my journals, knowing instinctively that she'd invade my privacy if given the opportunity. But one afternoon, I'd come home early from school to find her in my room, my journals spread across my bed, reading through them with an expression of cold calculation. When she'd noticed me in the doorway, her expression had shifted instantly to concern. "Oh, honey, I was putting away your laundry, and these fell out of your drawer. I'm worried about you." These writings, they show some very concerning patterns. Paranoia, distorted thinking, an inability to accept reality. Just like Margaret's early journals before she had to be hospitalized. I'd been terrified in that moment, genuinely frightened that maybe she was right, maybe I was showing signs of the same mental illness that had destroyed my aunt's life. But now, lying in Dad's guest room 18 years later, I understood what had actually happened. She'd been searching for my journals, specifically looking for documentation of her gaslighting that she could twist into evidence of my supposed mental instability. She'd been building her case even then, when I was just a teenager, planning decades ahead for the moment when she could use it. The next morning, I met with Gerald Morrison in his downtown office. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady, competent demeanor that made you understand why Dad had trusted him for 2 decades. I brought the forged documents my mother had shown me, along with the real will from Dad's safe. Gerald examined both sets carefully, his expression growing progressively darker as he read through my mother's fabricated papers. "These are sophisticated forgeries," he said finally, setting them down on his polished desk. "The letterhead is convincing, the legal language is mostly correct, and someone clearly put significant effort into making them appear legitimate. But there are problems. The notary seal on these amendments is from a notary who doesn't exist in Minnesota's database. The attorney whose name appears on the documents, Harold Westbrook, was disbarred 3 years ago for ethics violations. And most significantly, your father's signature is wrong. He pulled out several legitimate documents Dad had signed, property deeds, contracts, the real will, and laid them beside the forged amendments. Look here," Gerald pointed to the signatures. "Your father had a very distinctive signature. The capital T in Thomas had this particular flourish, and he always connected the R and the O in a specific way. These forged documents have a signature that's close, but it's not quite right. Someone traced or copied his signature, but they didn't understand the actual mechanics of how he formed the letters." I felt a mixture of relief and renewed anger. Relief that the forgeries were provable as fake, anger that my mother had gone to such lengths, had paid someone to create these sophisticated, fraudulent documents, all to steal what my father had explicitly wanted me to have. "What do we do now?" I asked. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "First, we file your father's legitimate will for probate immediately. That establishes the legal record. Second, I'm going to contact the county attorney's office. What your mother did, creating and presenting forged estate documents, is a felony. It's estate fraud, and it carries serious criminal penalties. Third, we document everything. Every interaction you have with her from this point forward needs to be recorded, documented, preserved as evidence. She mentioned having medical documentation, I said. Records from psychiatric facilities, treatment histories, things that supposedly prove I'm mentally unstable. But I've never been to any of those places, never been treated for anything like what she described. How did she get fake medical records? That's another serious crime, Gerald replied. Medical fraud, identity theft, potentially insurance fraud if she filed claims in your name. We'll need to contact each facility she mentioned and request your actual medical records, which presumably will show you've never been a patient there. That documentation will prove she fabricated everything. Over the next week, I threw myself into building a case against my mother with the same meticulous attention to detail Dad had taught me to apply to property management. I requested medical records from every psychiatric facility in Minnesota and Wisconsin, documenting that I'd never been a patient at any of them. I contacted the state medical board to report fraudulent records being created in my name. I gathered every email, text message, and voicemail my mother had sent over the past decade, creating a timeline of her gaslighting and manipulation. James Chin provided detailed written statements about Dad's conversations regarding his estate plans, his concerns about my mother's potential interference, and his explicit wishes that everything go to me with no complications. Dad's accountant, his other business partners, even the property managers who'd worked with us both, they all provided statements confirming that Dad had considered me fully competent, had planned to leave me the business, had never expressed any concerns about my mental health or capability. But perhaps the most valuable evidence came from an unexpected source. My father's neighbor, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, who'd been the one to call 911 when Dad collapsed, contacted me 3 days after my meeting with Gerald. She was in her 70s, a retired teacher who'd lived next door to Dad for over a decade. "Elizabeth, dear, I need to tell you something that's been bothering me since the funeral," she said when I visited her at her home. "Your mother came to see your father about 2 months before he passed. I was gardening in my front yard, and I heard them arguing on his porch. She was demanding money, saying she deserved a share of his business, that she'd sacrificed her prime years for him. Your father told her very clearly that she'd received her divorce settlement years ago and that everything he had was going to you. She said something that chilled me. She said, 'Fine, then I'll make sure Elizabeth isn't competent to inherit it.' My hand started shaking as I processed this. 'Did you tell anyone about this? The police? Gerald?' Mrs. Kowalski looked apologetic. 'I should have, but I thought it was just angry talk, hyperbole from a bitter ex-wife. I never imagined she'd actually try to follow through on it. But after the funeral, the way she was acting, presenting herself as the grieving widow when everyone knew they'd been divorced for decades, it made me remember that conversation, and I realized she'd been planning this. Would you be willing to provide a written statement about what you heard?' I asked, 'and possibly testify if this goes to court?' 'Absolutely,' she said firmly. 'Your father was a good man, and he worked too hard for his estate to be stolen by someone who'd already taken enough from him.' Armed with mounting evidence, Gerald filed the real will for probate and simultaneously contacted the county attorney's office about the fraud. The assistant county attorney assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Patricia Delgado, was immediately interested. Estate fraud cases like this are more common than people think, she told me during our first meeting. Family members, especially those who feel entitled to assets they're not legally owed, will sometimes go to extraordinary lengths. But this case is particularly egregious because of the scope of the fraud: forged legal documents, fabricated medical records, a decades-long campaign of psychological manipulation. We're taking this very seriously. 2 weeks after Dad's funeral, my mother received notification that the real had been filed for probate and that she was under investigation for multiple counts of fraud. Her response was immediate and explosive. She hired an attorney, an expensive one, apparently funded by a loan against her apartment, and filed a formal contest of the will, claiming that Dad had been unduly influenced by me, that I'd isolated him from his family, that the will filed by Gerald was actually the forgery, not her documents. Her attorney, a middle-aged man named Richard Stokes with a reputation for taking questionable cases if the price was right, submitted a lengthy filing that essentially accused me of everything my mother had been planning to accuse me of: mental instability, manipulation of an elderly man, isolation tactics, and financial exploitation. It was a complete reversal of reality, and reading through the accusations felt like being gaslight all over again. But this time in legal documents submitted to a court. Gerald was unfazed. "This is a desperate, defensive strategy," he explained. "She knows the evidence against her fraud is overwhelming, so she's trying to create enough confusion and controversy to muddy the waters. But we have documentation. She has fabrications. The truth will win out, but we need to be prepared for this to get uglier before it's resolved." Ugly was an understatement. My mother launched a campaign of harassment that would have been impressive in its scope if it weren't so destructive. She contacted Dad's business associates, clients, and friends, spreading the story that I'd manipulated him, isolated him, possibly even hastened his death to get access to his money faster. She posted on social media, something she'd rarely done before, presenting herself as a grieving mother fighting to protect her mentally ill daughter from herself, asking for legal fund donations to help her get Elizabeth the help she needs. She contacted my employer in Chicago, telling them I was going through a severe mental health crisis and suggesting they put me on medical leave for my own safety. She called my friends, my colleagues, anyone whose contact information she could find, spreading her narrative of me as unstable, dangerous, and unfit to manage my own life, much less a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. The psychological toll was enormous. Even though I knew the truth, even though I had evidence and documentation proving her fraud, the constant barrage of accusations started to wear me down. I found myself lying awake at night, running through conversations and memories, double-checking my own perceptions, fighting against the very self-doubt she'd programmed into me over decades. There were moments when I wondered if maybe I was remembering things wrong, if perhaps Dad had expressed concerns to her that he hadn't shared with me, if possibly there was some truth buried in her lies. Those were the darkest moments, when the gaslighting threatened to work even from a distance, even with overwhelming evidence on my side. But I had something now that I'd never had before: witnesses. People who'd known Dad, who'd worked with him, who'd heard him express his actual thoughts and plans. James Chin called me almost daily to check in, to remind me of conversations he'd had with Dad about how proud he was of me, how confident he was in my abilities. Gerald sent regular updates about the legal proceedings, methodically dismantling each of my mother's claims with documentation and evidence. Mrs. Kowalski stopped by with homemade cookies and stories about Dad working in his yard, talking about his plans for the business, his excitement about me taking over eventually. These people became my anchor to reality. Proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't the unstable person my mother had spent 34 years trying to convince me I was. But the battle was far from over, and my mother's next move would be her most calculated and dangerous yet. She found my Aunt Margaret's medical records, the real ones from decades ago, and her attorney submitted them as evidence in the will contest, arguing that severe mental illness ran in the family and that I was exhibiting the same patterns Margaret had shown before her breakdown. The implication was clear and devastating. I was genetically predisposed to mental illness. I was following the same trajectory as my aunt, and therefore I was not competent to inherit or manage my father's estate. The court, my mother argued through her attorney, had a responsibility to protect me from myself by appointing a conservator, specifically my mother, to manage the inheritance on my behalf until such time as I could prove mental competency through extensive psychiatric evaluation. When Gerald showed me the court filing that included Aunt Margaret's medical records, I felt a rage so pure and focused that it almost frightened me. My mother wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance anymore. She was weaponizing my dead aunt's tragic mental illness, using Margaret's suffering as ammunition in her campaign to paint me as incompetent. It was exploitation on a level that seemed almost incomprehensible, even for someone who'd spent decades gaslighting her own daughter. "This is actually good for our case," Gerald said, which seemed counterintuitive until he explained. "Your mother's attorney is making a genetic argument that mental illness runs in your family and therefore you're likely to be affected. But genetics doesn't work that way legally. Millions of people have relatives with mental illness and are perfectly healthy themselves. We can bring in medical experts, have you evaluated by independent psychiatrists who'll confirm you have no diagnosable mental health conditions." Meanwhile, this move shows the court exactly how far your mother is willing to go, how she'll exploit anything and anyone, including her deceased sister's medical history, to get what she wants. He was right, but it still felt violating. I'd never known much about Aunt Margaret. My mother had always controlled the narrative about her, using Margaret as a cautionary tale but never really explaining what had happened to her or why. Now, reading through Margaret's actual medical records as part of the court filing, I learned things my mother had never told me. Margaret hadn't just been mentally ill. She'd been systematically abused by their parents, gaslit and manipulated until she genuinely couldn't distinguish reality from the false narratives they'd fed her. Her breakdown hadn't been genetic or inevitable. It had been engineered, deliberately created by the same kind of psychological warfare my mother had been waging against me. The records included notes from Margaret's therapist, who'd written in one session report, "Patient describes a family system where reality is consistently denied, where her perceptions are labeled as crazy or wrong, where her mother and younger sister work together to undermine her confidence in her own mind." Classic gaslighting patterns. Patients' mental health struggles appear to be reactive to sustained psychological abuse rather than organic mental illness. I sat in Gerald's office, reading these words written 40 years ago about my aunt, and I realized with horrifying clarity that my mother had learned her tactics from her own mother. This wasn't just about my inheritance or even about my relationship with my mother. This was a generational pattern, a cycle of psychological abuse that had destroyed Margaret and was now being turned on me. The difference was that Margaret had been isolated, with no one believing her, while I had evidence, witnesses, and people who'd seen through my mother's manipulation. "I want to be evaluated," I told Gerald, "by the best psychiatric experts we can find. I want comprehensive psychological testing that proves beyond any doubt that I'm mentally sound, competent, and nothing like what my mother claims. And I want those evaluations submitted to the court along with Margaret's therapist's notes about the family's pattern of abuse." Over the next month, I underwent 3 separate psychiatric evaluations by independent experts. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in capacity evaluations, spent 6 hours with me over 2 sessions, administering cognitive tests, personality assessments, and detailed interviews about my life, my relationship with my parents, and my mother's behavior patterns. Her report was comprehensive and unambiguous. I showed no signs of mental illness, demonstrated high cognitive functioning, exhibited normal emotional responses appropriate to grief and stress, and described a clear pattern of having been the victim of sustained psychological manipulation and gaslighting by my mother. Dr. Chen's report specifically addressed my mother's claims. Ms. Harlow presents as a highly functioning, emotionally stable individual with no indicators of psychosis, delusional thinking, or impaired reality testing. Her descriptions of her mother's behavior are consistent with well-documented patterns of narcissistic abuse and gaslighting. Her decision to keep detailed journals as a teenager specifically because she doubted her own perceptions shows insight and self-protective behavior, not paranoia. The claim that she is genetically predisposed to mental illness based on her aunt's history is not supported by any current symptoms or behaviors. The second evaluation, by Dr. Michael Torres, a neuropsychologist, focused on cognitive function and decision-making capacity. His testing showed that my IQ was in the superior range, my memory function was excellent, and my executive functioning, the ability to plan, organize, and make sound judgments, was well above average. Ms. Harlow demonstrates precisely the kind of cognitive abilities necessary to manage complex financial affairs and business operations, his report concluded. There is no neurological or cognitive basis for claims of incompetence. The third evaluation was perhaps the most important. Dr. Patricia Williams was a clinical psychologist who specialized in family trauma and psychological abuse. She'd reviewed all the evidence in the case, the forged documents, my mother's statements, the witness testimonies, Margaret's medical records, my documented history of my mother's gaslighting behavior. Her report placed everything in a clear clinical framework that even people without psychological training could understand. This is a textbook case of multigenerational psychological abuse, Dr. Williams wrote. The pattern evident in Margaret Harlow's medical records from the 1980s, systematic denial of reality, undermining of self-trust, use of mental illness as a weapon of control, is identical to the pattern Catherine Harlow has employed against her daughter Elizabeth for over 3 decades. This is not coincidence. This is learned behavior, passed down from one generation to the next. The difference is that Elizabeth, unlike her Aunt Margaret, had protective factors, a supportive father, the ability to document her experiences, and eventually the insight to recognize the manipulation for what it was. Dr. Williams's report went further, analyzing the forged documents and my mother's legal strategy, the fabricated psychiatric records, the forged estate documents, the claims of incompetence. These are not the actions of a concerned parent. These are the calculated moves of someone who has spent years building a narrative to serve an eventual purpose. Ms. Catherine Harlow created a decades-long record of calling her daughter's perceptions into question specifically so that when this moment came, when there was something valuable to be gained, she could deploy that narrative as a weapon. This represents sophisticated, premeditated psychological abuse in service of financial fraud. Armed with these 3 comprehensive evaluations, Gerald filed a motion to dismiss my mother's will contest and simultaneously provided all the evidence to Patricia Delgado at the county attorney's office. The criminal investigation into my mother's fraud was proceeding in parallel to the probate case, and the evidence was mounting into an overwhelming picture of calculated deception. But my mother wasn't finished yet. When her attorney saw the psychiatric evaluations, he apparently advised her that the will contest was likely to fail and that she was facing serious criminal charges. Her response was to escalate in ways that crossed from manipulation into outright harassment and threat. She began showing up at properties owned by Harlow Properties, introducing herself to tenants as the new owner, telling them that there would be changes in management, that I was mentally unfit and would soon be removed from any role in the company. She contacted the banks where Harlow Properties had accounts and business relationships, claiming that as my father's ex-wife, she had concerns about my competency to manage the business and suggesting they freeze accounts pending legal resolution of the estate. She even went to the county recorder's office and attempted to file liens against several of Dad's properties, claiming she was owed money from the marriage settlement. Liens that were quickly rejected because she had no legal basis for them, but the attempt itself showed how far she was willing to go. James Chin called me after she'd shown up at one of our commercial properties, a small shopping center where she'd attempted to schedule a meeting with the major tenants. Elizabeth, this has moved beyond legal maneuvering into active sabotage, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's trying to damage the business itself, possibly hoping that if she can create enough chaos, the court will decide you're not capable of managing things and will need someone else to step in. We need to stop her before she does real harm to relationships with tenants and lenders. Gerald filed for an emergency restraining order, documenting all of my mother's interference with the business operations. The hearing was scheduled quickly, given the ongoing probate case and the potential for business damage. I had to face my mother in court for the first time since this all began, sitting across a courtroom while Gerald presented evidence of her harassment, her attempts to interfere with business operations, her her pattern of showing up at properties and making false claims to tenants and vendors. My mother's attorney, Richard Stokes, tried to paint her actions as those of a concerned parent exercising appropriate oversight of a business she claimed partial interest in, but the judge wasn't buying it. Judge Martha Reynolds was in her early 50s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings and little patience for legal games. She listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence Gerald presented, and then turned to my mother directly. "Mrs. Harlow, I've reviewed the probate case, I've seen the evidence of forged documents, and I've read the psychiatric evaluations of your daughter. What I see here is not a concerned parent, but someone engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and interference based on claims that appear to be entirely fabricated. The restraining order is granted. You are prohibited from contacting your daughter except through attorneys, prohibited from entering any property owned by Harlow Properties, and prohibited from contacting any tenants, vendors, employees, or business associates of Harlow Properties. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and criminal contempt charges. Do you understand?" My mother stood, her face flushed with rage, her carefully maintained mask of concerned parent finally cracking completely. "She's not well," my mother said, her voice rising. "You're making a mistake. She needs help, protection, oversight. Her aunt died in a psychiatric facility, and she's heading down the same path. Someone needs to—" "Mrs. Harlow," Judge Reynolds interrupted sharply, "your daughter has been evaluated by 3 independent psychiatric experts, all of whom found her to be mentally sound and fully competent. What I see in this courtroom is not a daughter who needs protection from herself, but a daughter who needs protection from a parent who appears willing to destroy her child's reputation, mental health, and financial security for personal gain. We're done here." The restraining order was granted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. My mother could no longer show up at properties, could no longer contact my tenants or employees, could no longer wage her campaign of harassment and interference directly. But the probate case and the criminal investigation were both still ongoing, and I knew she wasn't done fighting yet. What I didn't expect was how the restraining order would finally force my mother to show her hand completely. Within days of the court hearing, her attorney Richard Stokes withdrew from her case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. According to the legal grapevine Gerald heard through, my mother had insisted on pursuing strategies Stokes considered unethical or potentially illegal, and he decided the case wasn't worth risking his license over. Without legal representation and facing mounting criminal charges, my mother did something that initially seemed like surrender. She called Gerald's office and said she wanted to negotiate a settlement. She was willing to drop the will contest, to admit the documents she'd presented were false, and to sign a comprehensive release of any claims to Dad's estate. In exchange, she wanted me to agree not to pursue criminal charges and to provide her with a one-time payment of $50,000 to help her move forward with her life. Gerald presented this offer to me in his office, his expression skeptical. "It sounds too easy," he said. "Your mother has fought this aggressively, has risked criminal prosecution, has burned every bridge. Now suddenly she's willing to walk away for $50,000? Something doesn't add up." He was right to be suspicious. We discovered what my mother was really planning when Patricia Delgado from the county attorney's office called with disturbing news. "Elizabeth, we've been monitoring your mother's activities as part of the fraud investigation. We received information from a concerned citizen, someone your mother apparently approached to help with her plan. She's been attempting to hire someone to break into your home and create a scene that would make you appear mentally unstable. The idea was to stage it to look like you'd had some kind of psychotic break, destroyed your own property, possibly hurt yourself. Then she'd use that as evidence to have you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, which would give her grounds to seek emergency conservatorship." The words hit me like ice water. My mother had moved beyond fraud and manipulation into something far darker, She was literally trying to manufacture evidence of insanity that would justify locking me up in a psychiatric facility. Exactly what had happened to Aunt Margaret. The generational pattern was repeating with terrifying precision, except this time I had advocates who saw through it. The person she approached was uncomfortable with the plan and contacted us instead, Patricia continued. We have recordings of conversations where your mother laid out exactly what she wanted done. This isn't just fraud anymore, Elizabeth. This is conspiracy to commit assault, false imprisonment, and several other serious felonies. We're moving forward with criminal charges regardless of any civil settlement. The recordings were played for me in Patricia's office, and hearing my mother's voice calmly discussing how to make me appear crazy, how to create a convincing scene of mental breakdown, how to time it so she could swoop in as the concerned parent seeking emergency intervention. It was surreal and horrifying. This was the woman who'd raised me, who I'd loved despite everything, who I'd kept hoping would somehow acknowledge what she'd done and why it was wrong. I need you to understand something, Patricia said after the recordings ended. Your mother is not going to stop unless she's stopped by force. She's escalated from manipulation to fraud to conspiracy to commit violence. The pattern with people like this is that they keep escalating until there are real consequences, legal consequences that can't be talked away or manipulated. Within a week, my mother was arrested and charged with multiple felonies: fraud, forgery, identity theft for the fake medical records, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted false imprisonment. The bail was set high given the severity of the charges and the judge's concern that she might try to contact me or interfere further with the estate despite the restraining order. She spent 3 days in jail before scraping together bail money, reportedly from a loan her sister, Margaret's younger sister, who I'd never met, reluctantly provided. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months out, which meant I had time to focus on the probate case and taking over Dad's business officially. The real will sailed through probate unopposed now that my mother had bigger legal problems to worry about. Judge Reynolds signed the order approving the will, transferring all of Dad's assets to me, and officially recognizing me as the sole owner and operator of Harlow Properties. Standing in that courtroom when the judge signed the final order, I felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions. Relief that the legal battle was over, grief that Dad wasn't there to see it, anger at everything my mother had put me through, and a strange kind of sadness for what our relationship could have been if she'd been capable of seeing me as a person rather than a threat to her financial interests. James Chin threw a small celebration at the Harlow Properties office, inviting the property managers, key employees, and business partners who'd supported me through everything. Mrs. Kowalski came, bringing her famous apple pie. Gerald attended, raising a toast to Dad's memory and to the victory of truth over fraud. Even Patricia Delgado stopped by briefly, reminding me that the criminal case was still pending but expressing confidence about the outcome given the overwhelming evidence. Your father would be proud of how you handled this, James told me quietly during the gathering. Not just the legal fight, but how you didn't let your mother's manipulation make you doubt yourself. How you built a case with documentation and evidence instead of just fighting emotion with emotion. That's the business mind he saw in you, the reason he knew you were the right person to carry on what he built. The criminal trial happened 4 months later. I had to testify, had to sit on the witness stand and describe decades of gaslighting, manipulation, and psychological abuse while my mother sat at the defense table staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part hatred, part bewilderment, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't still playing my assigned role in her narrative. The prosecution presented the forged documents, the fake medical records, the recordings of her conspiracy to stage my mental breakdown, and testimony from Mrs. Kowalski about the conversation she'd overheard. Dr. Williams testified as an expert witness about the pattern of psychological abuse and how it fit into my mother's larger scheme. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, my mother was given the opportunity to make a statement. I expected her to continue denying, to maintain her victim narrative, to blame me for ruining her life. Instead, she stood and said something that still haunts me. I gave birth to you. I raised you. Everything I did was because I deserved something for those sacrifices. You took everything from me, my marriage, my financial security, my future. All I wanted was what was rightfully mine. Even then, even facing years in prison, she couldn't acknowledge what she'd actually done. In her mind, she was still the victim, still the wrong party, still entitled to whatever she could take from me regardless of what it cost me emotionally, psychologically, or financially. The gaslighting was so deep, so fundamental to how she saw the world, that she'd gaslit herself into genuinely believing her own lies. Judge Reynolds sentenced her to 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5, citing the sustained nature of the fraud, the psychological damage inflicted, and the escalation to conspiracy to commit violence. My mother was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I watched her go feeling nothing but a hollow kind of relief. The aftermath has been a long process of rebuilding and healing. I've been running Harlow Properties for 18 months now, and the business is thriving. I've expanded into sustainable housing development, something Dad had been interested in but never pursued. I've promoted several long-term employees into management positions, including creating a role for James Chin as Chief Operating Officer. The properties are well maintained, the tenants are happy, and I've started a scholarship fund in Dad's name for students studying business or real estate management. I've also been in therapy, working through decades of gaslighting and its effects. My therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martin, specializes in trauma from narcissistic abuse. And she's helped me understand that what my mother did wasn't just about money. It was about control, about needing me to be small and doubtful and dependent so she could feel powerful and important. Recognizing that pattern, seeing how it connects to what happened to Aunt Margaret, has been painful but also liberating. I've learned that the opposite of gaslighting isn't just truth. It's trusting yourself enough to recognize truth when you see it, even when someone you love is insisting you're wrong. It's documentation, evidence, and witnesses who can confirm your reality when someone tries to deny it. It's building a life where your boundaries are respected and your perceptions are validated, not constantly questioned. If you're watching this and you've experienced anything similar, a family member who constantly tells you you're remembering wrong, who uses concern about your mental health as a weapon, who makes you doubt your own mind, please know that you're not crazy. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find people who validate your reality instead of undermining it. And don't be afraid to set boundaries or walk away from people who refuse to respect your truth, even if they're family. Please leave a comment below sharing your own experiences with family manipulation or gaslighting. So many people suffer in silence because they think no one will believe them or that they're overreacting. But the more we talk about these patterns, the more we can recognize and resist them. And if this story helped you feel less alone or gave you clarity about your own situation, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. These stories matter, and sharing them helps others who are going through similar struggles. My mother will be eligible for parole in about 3.5 years. I don't know what will happen then, whether she'll have gained any insight or will still be clinging to her victim narrative. What I do know is that I'm no longer the uncertain, self-doubting person she tried to make me believe I was. I'm the person my father saw, capable, strong, and worthy of the legacy he worked his entire life to build. Dad left me more than property and money. He left me proof that I was valued, that my capabilities were real, that someone saw me clearly and believed in me completely. That's the inheritance that really matters. The one my mother could never steal no matter how hard she tried. And that's what I'm building on now, not just managing properties, but creating something that honors the man who saw me for who I really was and trusted me to carry forward what he started. The house I live in now isn't Dad's house. I sold that property because the memories were too painful. It's a smaller place downtown, modern and minimalist, with big windows that let in lots of light. There's no shadows here, no dark corners where old manipulations can hide. It's mine, fully mine, and every decision I make about it reflects who I actually am, not who someone else tried to convince me I was. That's what freedom from gaslighting looks like. A life built on your own perceptions, your own choices, your own truth. It wasn't easy to get here, and the scars from the battle are still healing. But I'm here, standing in the light, running my father's company with the competence he always knew I had, and finally trusting myself the way he always trusted me. And my mother? She's exactly where she put herself through her own choices, her own lies, her own desperate need to control and diminish me. I didn't put her there. The truth did. And that's the final lesson in all of this. Eventually, the truth has weight that no amount of manipulation can overcome forever.